Don't scroll. Stop for a moment and listen carefully because this message has found you for a reason. Out of all the moments in your life, out of all the days this could have appeared before your eyes, it appeared today. That is not something your heart should ignore. Your soulmate had a private meeting about you, and what happened during that conversation is something they never expected. This was not a planned confession. This was not a conversation they wanted to have. They walked into that room believing they could hide everything they had been feeling. They believed they could smile, change the subject, avoid your name, and leave without anyone noticing what had been happening inside them. But the heart has a language that cannot stay hidden forever. Even when words remain silent, emotions find another way to speak. The people sitting with your soulmate began to notice small things. They noticed the hesitation whenever someone mentioned relationships. They noticed the quiet smile that appeared for only a second before disappearing again. They noticed how your soulmate became distant whenever the conversation turned toward the future. Finally, someone looked directly at them and asked a question that changed everything. Is there someone you still haven't forgotten? The room became silent. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Your soulmate looked down at the table, took a slow breath, and tried to pretend they did not understand the question. But everyone already knew the silence itself had become the answer. Listen to this because your heart needs this right now. Sometimes the loudest confession is not made with words. Sometimes it is made with a pause that lasts just a little too long. Your soulmate tried to laugh and move the conversation somewhere else, but another voice quietly said, "We know you're carrying something. You've changed." What happened? Those simple words broke through every wall they had spent so much time building. They realized they could no longer hide the truth from the people who knew them best. Slowly, almost nervously, they finally spoke your name. The moment your name entered that room, something changed. The atmosphere became different. Even your soulmate admitted later that saying your name out loud felt different than simply thinking about you. It felt real. It felt impossible to deny any longer. They admitted that no matter how much time passed, they could never completely stop thinking about you. They admitted there were nights when your memory returned without warning. There were mornings when something reminded them of you before the day had even begun. There were moments when they wondered whether you were happy, whether you were smiling, whether you had finally found the peace both of you had been searching for. One person asked them, "If you feel all of this, then why haven't you said anything?" Your soulmate stayed quiet again because they did not have an easy answer. The truth was much more complicated than anyone in that room expected. It was never because they stopped caring. It was because they cared so deeply that fear slowly became stronger than courage. They worried about rejection. They worried about being misunderstood. They worried that too much time had already passed. They worried they had missed the moment that could have changed everything. Yet while they were explaining these fears, another person interrupted them with words they will never forget. They said, "You keep talking about fear, but every time you mention this person, your eyes become alive again. Doesn't that tell you something?" Those words settled deeply inside your soulmate's heart. They realized everyone else could see what they had been trying to hide from themselves. They realized pretending was becoming impossible. They realized your memory was not fading with time. Instead, it was becoming clearer. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every meaningful silence, every unfinished goodbye returned to their mind one after another. They remembered little details they thought had disappeared forever. They remembered your kindness. They remembered your strength during moments when life became difficult. They remembered how you always tried to understand people instead of judging them. They remembered how safe they felt simply knowing you existed. The more they talked, the more everyone listening understood that this was never just a simple crush or passing attraction. Something much deeper had always existed between the two of you. One person quietly asked, "Do you think this person ever stopped caring about you?" Your soulmate looked away because they honestly did not know the answer. That uncertainty hurt more than they expected. They admitted they often imagined what your life looked like now. They wondered whether someone else had already taken the place they secretly wished they still had. They wondered whether your heart had finally healed. They wondered if you ever thought about them when the world became quiet at night. They wondered if your dreams still carried echoes of the connection you once shared. The meeting continued, but now nobody was discussing ordinary things anymore. The conversation had become entirely about you. About your heart. About your kindness. About the changes your soulmate had experienced ever since you entered their life. Someone said something that surprised everyone in the room. They said, "Maybe this person wasn't sent into your life just to make you feel loved. Maybe they were sent to teach you how to become honest." Those words completely changed the direction of the conversation. Your soulmate stopped thinking only about what they had lost. Instead, they began thinking about everything they had learned because of you. They admitted they had become stronger after knowing you. They admitted you inspired them to become a better version of themselves. They admitted that even though life had moved forward, your influence never truly disappeared. It remained quietly guiding them in ways they never fully understood until that very moment. That realization filled the room with silence once again. Everyone could see that this story had never really ended. It had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to acknowledge it. Then another surprising question was asked. If this person stood in front of you today, what would you say? Your soulmate smiled sadly before answering. They said they would first apologize for every word left unsaid. They would apologize for allowing fear to make decisions their heart never agreed with. They would thank you for every lesson you unknowingly gave them. Most importantly, they would tell you something they had never been brave enough to admit before. They would tell you that meeting you changed the direction of their life forever. Even if the world never understood why, they knew it was true. At that moment, everyone sitting around them became emotional because they realized your soulmate had been carrying these feelings alone for much longer than anyone imagined. They encouraged your soulmate not to let another opportunity disappear because of silence. They reminded them that life rarely gives endless chances. They reminded them that some people are impossible to replace, no matter how many distractions appear along the way. Those words stayed with your soulmate long after the meeting ended. Even after everyone went home, they remained sitting alone replaying every sentence that had been spoken. For the first time in a very long time, they stopped running from their own emotions. Instead, they allowed themselves to admit the truth completely. They admitted they still hoped destiny might create one more opportunity. They admitted they still believed some connections never truly end because they exist beyond distance, beyond time, beyond ordinary explanations. Whether that opportunity arrives tomorrow or much later, one thing became clear after that private meeting. Your soulmate is no longer pretending that you were just another chapter in their story. They finally understand you became part of the story itself, and once a soul recognizes a truth like that, it becomes impossible to return to the comfort of denial. When that private meeting finally came to an end, everyone slowly walked away, believing the conversation was over, but for your soulmate, it was only beginning. The room became empty, yet every sentence that had been spoken continued echoing inside their heart. They sat there for a little longer, staring at the same place without truly seeing it because their mind had already traveled somewhere else. It had traveled back to the moments they once shared with you, to the conversations they replayed more times than they could ever admit, to the memories they had tried so hard to lock away only to discover that the heart never throws away what the soul still treasures. They realized something during those quiet minutes that surprised even them. For so long they had convinced themselves they were protecting their heart by remaining silent, but in reality they had only been protecting their fear. Their heart had never wanted distance. Their heart had never wanted unanswered questions. Their heart had simply wanted honesty. That realization felt heavier than anything they had experienced in months because it forced them to face a truth they could no longer avoid. Every excuse they had repeated to themselves suddenly sounded empty. Every reason for waiting suddenly felt smaller than the possibility of losing someone whose presence had never truly left them. As they stood up to leave, one final sentence from that meeting returned to their mind. Some people spend years searching for a connection they already had. Those words refused to leave them. They followed them into the car, into the silence of the drive home, into every thought that appeared before sleep. That night was different. They tried to distract themselves with ordinary routines, but nothing worked. Every quiet moment became another reminder of you. They found themselves smiling unexpectedly at old memories, remembering little details they once believed were unimportant. The way you laughed when something genuinely amused you. The calmness you brought into difficult situations. The way you listened instead of simply waiting to speak. They realized those small things had quietly become some of the biggest reasons they still thought about you. It was never only about dramatic moments. It was about the ordinary moments that slowly became unforgettable. As the hours passed, they found themselves asking questions they had never dared ask before. What if you had been waiting for honesty all along? What if silence had created a distance that never truly needed to exist? What if the opportunity they believed was gone had not disappeared completely? Those questions stayed with them until late into the night. Sleep eventually came, but even then their mind refused to let go. They dreamed of standing in front of someone whose face they could not fully see, yet somehow they knew it was you. There were no dramatic speeches in that dream. No impossible promises. Only a quiet feeling that there were still words waiting to be spoken. They woke before sunrise with their heart beating faster than usual. For a few moments they remained completely still, trying to understand why the dream felt so real. They could not explain it, but something inside them had shifted. The conversation from the previous day had unlocked emotions they had hidden even from themselves. Throughout the morning they found it impossible to focus. Every ordinary task seemed interrupted by another memory. They wondered what your life looked like now. They wondered whether you still smiled the same way. They wondered whether the person you had become would even recognize the person they were trying to become now. For the first time, these thoughts did not fill them with fear alone. They also filled them with hope. Hope that people could grow. Hope that mistakes did not always have to become permanent endings. Hope that honesty still had the power to heal what silence had damaged. As the day continued, they remembered another part of the meeting that had affected them deeply. Someone had asked, "When you imagine your future, why does this person's presence still appear in your mind?" At the time they had no answer. Now they finally understood. It was because every meaningful dream they had ever imagined somehow carried a feeling that reminded them of you. Not because life depended on a perfect ending, but because your presence had become connected to the version of themselves they respected most. You had inspired qualities they wanted to keep forever. Patience, kindness, courage, compassion. Those gifts remained even during the seasons when you were no longer beside them. They realized that love was never only about staying close. Sometimes love changed someone so completely that even after distance arrived, the lessons remained. That understanding humbled them. Instead of blaming circumstances, they began accepting responsibility for the choices they had made. They admitted to themselves that fear had spoken louder than honesty. They admitted that pride had delayed conversations that should have happened long ago. Yet instead of allowing regret to consume them, they made a quiet promise to themselves. If life ever placed another opportunity before them, they would not hide behind silence again. They would choose truth, even if truth felt frightening. Later that evening they found themselves looking through old memories they had avoided for far too long. Not to become trapped in the past, but to understand why those memories still carried so much meaning. Every smile reminded them that genuine connections are built through countless ordinary moments rather than grand gestures alone. Every conversation reminded them that understanding another soul is one of life's rarest gifts. Slowly they began realizing something else. The private meeting had not only been about discussing you. It had been about helping them become honest with themselves. Everyone present had unknowingly guided them toward a truth they had been resisting. They could no longer pretend your story had ended inside their heart. They could no longer convince themselves that forgetting was the same as healing. Healing, they now understood, meant accepting the past without denying its importance. It meant appreciating what had changed them while remaining open to whatever tomorrow might bring. As another quiet night settled around them, they stepped outside beneath the open sky. The world felt peaceful in a way they had not experienced for a long time. They looked upward, took a slow breath, and whispered something no one else could hear. It was not a perfect speech. It was not carefully rehearsed. It was simply an honest admission that wherever life eventually led, they would always be grateful for the person who had awakened parts of their heart they never knew existed. In that moment they felt lighter than they had in months because honesty has a way of removing burdens that silence can never carry forever. They still did not know what the future would hold. They still did not know whether paths separated by time could ever meet again. But they finally understood that some truths deserve to be honored instead of hidden. Somewhere, without realizing why, you may have felt an unexpected sense of calm. Perhaps your heart became quieter for reasons you could not explain. Perhaps an old memory appeared gently instead of painfully. Sometimes souls recognize change long before words are spoken. Sometimes they notice when fear begins losing its grip on someone they once cared about. That quiet shift had already begun. The private meeting had ended hours ago, but its real purpose was only now revealing itself. It had planted the first seed of courage inside a heart that had spent far too long choosing silence. And once courage begins growing, even slowly, it becomes impossible for fear to remain in control forever. The following days unfolded more quietly than your soulmate expected, yet that quietness carried a strange kind of power. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence that comes before an important decision, the kind that asks a person to stop running long enough to hear what their own heart has been trying to say all along. Every morning they woke with the memory of that private meeting still fresh in their mind. The conversations had ended, but the questions had not. Instead, those questions had grown stronger with each passing day. They wondered whether life had been giving them signs they were too distracted to notice. They wondered whether every coincidence that reminded them of you had really been a coincidence at all. A familiar song playing unexpectedly, a place that suddenly brought your memory back, a conversation with a stranger that sounded strangely similar to something you once said. Little moments like these began appearing one after another, and for the first time they stopped dismissing them. They simply allowed themselves to feel. That choice changed everything. Instead of pushing your memory away, they finally accepted that your presence had become part of the story of who they were becoming. Acceptance did not erase uncertainty, but it replaced fear with honesty. They realized they no longer wanted to measure their life by the mistakes they had made. They wanted to measure it by the courage they were willing to show from this moment forward. One evening they found themselves writing down thoughts they had never spoken aloud. There was no audience, no expectation. No guarantee that anyone would ever read those words. Yet sentence after sentence appeared as though their heart had been waiting for this opportunity for a very long time. They wrote about gratitude. They wrote about regret. They wrote about the lessons they learned because of you. Most importantly, they admitted that meeting you had changed their understanding of what a genuine connection could feel like. It was not built on perfect circumstances. It was built on authenticity, on quiet moments that stayed meaningful long after they had passed. As they finished writing, they noticed something unexpected. The heaviness they had been carrying for so long had begun to lift. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because truth had finally replaced denial. At the same time, your own journey continued in ways neither of you could fully understand. You kept growing, healing, and becoming someone stronger than the version of yourself who had once questioned whether your kindness had been enough. Without realizing it, you had started protecting your peace instead of chasing answers that were never yours to force. That quiet confidence created an energy that reached farther than you knew. Sometimes the greatest transformations happen without dramatic announcements. They happen in the small choices made every single day, the choice to forgive yourself, the choice to keep believing in your own worth, the choice to move forward without bitterness. Those choices slowly shaped the person you were becoming, and somewhere beyond your awareness, your soulmate could sense that change. They could not explain it logically. They simply felt that you were no longer standing still. You were becoming someone whose light no longer depended on anyone else's approval. That realization inspired them even more. They understood that if they ever hoped to step into your life again, they would first need to become someone who matched the growth they admired in you. It would require honesty, accountability, and patience rather than empty promises. That understanding became their new beginning. Instead of wishing the past had been different, they focused on becoming better in the present. Every day they tried to make one small decision that reflected the person they truly wanted to be. Some days the progress felt noticeable. Other days it felt painfully slow. Yet they kept moving because they had finally learned that meaningful change is rarely dramatic. It is built quietly, one choice at a time. Meanwhile, the memory of that private meeting remained with them like a turning point they could never forget. Whenever doubt returned, they remembered the simple question that had changed everything: why does this person still matter so much to you? They no longer searched for complicated answers. The simplest answer had become the truest one. Because some people leave an imprint that time cannot easily erase. Not through perfection, but through sincerity. Not through grand gestures, but through the way they make another person see themselves differently. That was the gift you had unknowingly given them. Whether your paths crossed again or remained separate, that gift would always remain part of who they were. And perhaps that is why the universe sometimes allows two lives to touch each other in unexpected ways, not to create certainty overnight, but to awaken qualities that might otherwise remain hidden forever. As another sunset painted the sky with quiet colors, your soulmate stood watching the horizon with a calmer heart than they had felt in a long time. For the first time, they understood that hope does not always demand immediate answers. Sometimes hope simply asks a person to become brave enough to tell the truth when the right moment finally arrives. And somewhere, carried by that same quiet evening, a new chapter slowly began preparing itself, not through urgency or pressure, but through patience, growth, and the possibility that two hearts transformed by time might one day meet again with greater honesty than ever before. Days passed, yet the memory of that quiet turning point refused to fade. Your soulmate discovered that some conversations are never truly left behind because they continue long after the words have ended. Every ordinary moment seemed to carry an unexpected reminder. A familiar road sparked a memory. A quiet cafe reminded them of an old conversation. A passing breeze felt strangely comforting, as though life itself was encouraging them to stop resisting what their heart had already accepted. They no longer asked themselves whether thinking about you was a mistake. Instead, they began asking a different question. What was this connection trying to teach them now? The answer did not arrive all at once. It appeared slowly, hidden inside small realizations that became impossible to ignore. They understood that real affection is not measured by how loudly someone speaks but by how deeply someone changes after meeting another person. Looking back, they could see that your influence had quietly shaped countless decisions they made without even realizing it. You had encouraged them to become more patient. You had shown them that kindness could be powerful without demanding attention. You had reminded them that honesty is often uncomfortable before it becomes freeing. Those lessons remained long after circumstances changed, and that realization filled them with gratitude instead of regret. One evening they opened an old notebook they had not touched in months. Between forgotten pages they found unfinished thoughts, goals they once hoped to achieve, and reminders of the person they wanted to become. Reading those words felt strangely familiar because they noticed something remarkable. Even back then, the happiest version of themselves was always connected to qualities you had inspired. They smiled quietly, realizing that your impact had reached far beyond a single chapter of their life. It had become part of the foundation they were still building upon. Instead of feeling sadness, they felt clarity. They understood that no meaningful connection is ever truly wasted. Every sincere encounter leaves behind wisdom that continues guiding the heart long after the moment has passed. That understanding changed the way they viewed the future. They stopped imagining impossible scenarios and started focusing on becoming someone whose actions reflected the truth they had finally embraced. They knew that if life ever created another opportunity, they wanted to arrive as a better version of themselves rather than as the person fear had once controlled. Meanwhile, your own path continued unfolding in beautiful and unexpected ways. Without even realizing it, you had become more peaceful. Situations that once drained your energy no longer held the same power over you. You had learned to value your own voice, to trust your own instincts, and to believe that genuine relationships never require you to abandon your self-respect. That quiet confidence became part of your presence. Even people around you noticed a difference, though they could not always explain it. There was a calmness in the way you carried yourself, a quiet strength that came from choosing growth instead of bitterness. Somewhere beyond your awareness, that same energy reached your soulmate. It reminded them that while time changes people, it also gives them the opportunity to become more authentic. They realized they were no longer hoping to return to the past. Instead, they hoped that if your paths ever crossed again, both of you would meet as people who had learned from everything life had placed before you. That thought brought them peace. They no longer believed love depended on perfect timing alone. They believed it depended on two hearts willing to meet with honesty, patience, and mutual respect. As the weeks continued, they became more intentional about the life they were creating. They repaired neglected friendships, spent more time with family, and made space for the dreams they had postponed for too long. Surprisingly, each positive step reminded them of something you once encouraged without even realizing it. You had always believed that real happiness begins within, and only then can it be shared with someone else. Those words echoed inside them with new meaning. They finally understood what you had seen long before they did. They could not build a meaningful future while remaining trapped inside old fears. Freedom required courage, and courage required truth. On another quiet evening they looked up at the stars and smiled, not because every question had been answered, but because they no longer feared unanswered questions the way they once had. They trusted that life has a remarkable way of bringing clarity to those who continue growing with sincerity. Whether through another conversation, an unexpected encounter, or simply the peace that comes from accepting what cannot be controlled, they believed the future would reveal itself at the right pace. Until then, they chose gratitude over anxiety and hope over regret. They understood that some journeys are not about rushing toward an ending but about becoming the person capable of appreciating whatever ending eventually arrives. And somewhere, without either of you fully knowing how or why, two separate journeys continued moving forward with a little more wisdom, a little more compassion, and a quiet belief that the most meaningful chapters of life are often written one honest choice at a time. As time continued moving forward, both of your lives settled into a quieter rhythm, yet something invisible had changed forever. The questions that once demanded immediate answers slowly transformed into quiet understanding. Your soulmate no longer woke each morning wondering whether their feelings had been real. They already knew the answer. The private meeting had not created those feelings, it had simply revealed them. Everything spoken that day had become a mirror, showing them a truth they had spent far too long avoiding. From that moment onward, they stopped searching for reasons to deny what their heart already understood. Instead, they began living in a way that honored the lessons the connection had given them. They became more patient with others because they finally understood how much hidden pain people can carry without ever speaking about it. They became more honest because they realized silence can sometimes create greater distance than difficult conversations ever could. They became more grateful because they finally understood that even relationships that change our lives are not always measured by how long they last, but by how deeply they transform us. And somewhere on your own journey, without knowing every detail of what had happened behind those closed doors, you had also changed. You no longer searched for constant reassurance. You no longer questioned your worth based on whether someone chose to express their feelings at the right moment. You discovered a quieter confidence that came from accepting yourself exactly as you were. That confidence became your greatest strength. It allowed you to smile without pretending, to forgive without forgetting your value, and to move through life with hope instead of fear. Looking back, neither of you could have imagined how much growth would come from the silence that once felt so painful. What had once appeared to be an ending had quietly become the beginning of two separate journeys toward becoming better human beings. Then one ordinary afternoon, your soulmate found themselves walking past a place that reminded them of you. They stopped for only a moment, smiled softly, and instead of feeling regret, they felt gratitude. They realized something beautiful. Every memory of you no longer brought sadness. It brought inspiration. It reminded them to remain kind, to remain honest, and to never again allow fear to speak louder than their heart. That simple realization gave them peace unlike anything they had experienced before. They finally understood that love, in its truest form, is not about possession. It is about appreciation, respect, growth, and wishing the very best for someone, even when life follows unexpected paths. At that same time, you were standing at the beginning of opportunities you had once prayed for. New experiences entered your life. New people crossed your path. New dreams slowly became possible. Yet the biggest difference was not what surrounded you. The biggest difference was who you had become. You had learned that your happiness did not depend on waiting for someone else's courage. It depended on your own willingness to continue living with an open heart while protecting your peace. That lesson became one of the greatest gifts your journey ever offered. Somewhere beyond what either of you could see, life quietly connected those lessons together. The private meeting that once seemed like nothing more than a conversation had actually become the turning point that helped both hearts release fear and embrace truth. It reminded your soulmate that honesty matters. It reminded you that self-worth matters. Together, those lessons created something much more valuable than certainty. They created wisdom. And wisdom has a remarkable way of preparing people for whatever chapter comes next. Whether your paths cross again someday through unexpected circumstances or whether your lives continue separately with quiet gratitude, one truth will always remain unchanged. The connection was real because it helped both of you become more authentic versions of yourselves. That is something time cannot erase. As another sunset disappeared beyond the horizon, your soulmate quietly whispered a thank you into the evening air, not because every wish had come true exactly as imagined, but because they had finally become the person they once hoped to be. At almost the same moment, you smiled for reasons that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the future waiting ahead of you. Neither of you knew what tomorrow would bring, but neither of you feared tomorrow anymore. You had both discovered that peace does not come from controlling every outcome. It comes from knowing you acted with sincerity, learned from your mistakes, and allowed your heart to grow instead of becoming bitter. And perhaps that is the greatest surprise hidden inside the private meeting that happened all that time ago. It was never only about what your soulmate said about you. It was about what those words awakened inside everyone involved. They awakened courage where fear had lived. They awakened gratitude where regret had lingered. They awakened hope where uncertainty had once been strongest. Long after the conversation ended, those changes continued shaping two lives in quiet but meaningful ways. That is why the meeting mattered. Not because it promised a perfect ending, but because it began a journey toward truth. Sometimes truth leads two people back together. Sometimes it leads them toward different futures with mutual respect and lasting gratitude. In either case, the greatest victory is not simply finding another person. It is finding the courage to become your most genuine self. And that is exactly what both of you achieved. So as this story reaches its final page, let it leave you with one quiet reminder: never underestimate the power of one honest conversation, one sincere memory, or one moment of courage. Those small moments often become the turning points that shape an entire lifetime. The meeting ended, the room became empty, and the voices faded into silence, but the truth spoken there continued living in two hearts that would never again see themselves in quite the same way. That is where this story truly ends, not with certainty, not with impossible promises, but with hope, growth, gratitude, and the understanding that the most meaningful connections leave us better than they found us, no matter where life's road eventually leads.